August 17, 1943, 7:48 a.m. Borum Airfield, New Guinea. 60 Mitsubishi G4M. Betty bombers sit in perfect rows along the runway. Their engines are running. Their fuel tanks are full. 400 Japanese airmen are strapped into their cockpits, waiting for takeoff clearance. In exactly 7 minutes, every single one of these aircraft will be transformed into burning wreckage. The men who will destroy them are already screaming toward Borum at 270 miles per hour, hidden below the jungle canopy, invisible to every Japanese lookout. They are flying B-25 Mitchell bombers. But these are not ordinary Mitchells. These are flying gun platforms carrying 14 50 caliber machine guns, each a modification so radical that the Army Air Forces initially called it insane. The man responsible for this insane modification is not a general, not an engineer with a fancy degree. He is a 47-year-old former Navy mechanic named Paul Irving Gunn, a man the military brass dismissed as a reckless tinkerer. In the next 30 seconds, Paul Gunn's crazy idea will destroy an entire Japanese air army and change the course of the Pacific War. This is the story of how one mechanic's forbidden experiment killed more enemy aircraft in 5 days than most squadrons destroyed in 5 years. This is the story of the Wewak Massacre. The situation in the Pacific in early 1943 was desperate for American forces. The Japanese 4th Air Army controlled the skies over New Guinea with an iron fist. 200 aircraft operated from 4 airfields clustered around the town of Wewak, launching bombing raids against Allied positions with near impunity. Every week brought new disasters. Supply convoys were attacked. Airfields were bombed. Ground troops died without ever seeing the enemy pilots who killed them. The Japanese bombers flew too high for effective anti-aircraft fire. Their Zero fighter escorts were faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans could put in the air. Allied commanders watched their casualty lists grow longer while their options grew shorter. The standard American bomber of the era was designed for one purpose: fly high, drop bombs, go home. The B-25 Mitchell was a medium bomber that cruised at 15,000 feet, releasing its payload from safe altitude and hoping for the best. Against dispersed jungle targets, this approach was almost useless. Bombs fell into the trees. Enemy aircraft scattered before the bombers arrived. The Japanese laughed at American inefficiency. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, knew something had to change. But what his bombers could not hit, what they could not see. His fighters could not reach Japanese airfields 400 miles away. His ground forces could not advance without air superiority. The war in New Guinea had become a frustrating stalemate, and American boys were dying every day because of it. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody took seriously. Paul Irving Gunn did not look like a war hero. He was short, balding, and perpetually covered in engine grease. He had enlisted in the Navy at 17, served 20 years as an aviation mechanic, and retired as a chief petty officer in 1939. He was supposed to be done with military life. He was supposed to be running a small airline in the Philippines, flying mail and cargo between the islands. Then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Gunn watched helplessly as Japanese bombers destroyed his airline. He watched Manila fall. He escaped to Australia with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning hatred for the enemy who had taken everything from him. At 47 years old with no college degree and no officer training, Paul Gunn walked into an Army Air Forces recruiting station and demanded a commission. They laughed at him. But Gunn was persistent. He knew aircraft engines better than anyone alive. He could fix anything that flew. Eventually, the desperate Army gave him a commission as a captain and assigned him to a maintenance depot in Australia. They expected him to repair damaged aircraft and keep his mouth shut. They had no idea what they had unleashed. Gunn spent his first weeks in Australia studying the B-25 Mitchell bomber. He watched squadron after squadron return from missions with minimal results. He listened to pilots complain about accuracy problems. He examined aircraft that had been shot up by Japanese fighters during their slow, predictable bombing runs. And one night, working alone in his maintenance hangar, Paul Gunn had an idea that would change everything. What if the bomber did not bomb at all? What if the B-25 became a giant fighter plane instead? Gunn's concept was revolutionary. Strip out the bombardier position in the nose of the aircraft. Remove the bomb sight. Remove everything that made the Mitchell a bomber. Then fill that empty nose with machine guns. Not one or two guns. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, all pointing straight ahead, all firing at once. The result would be a flying gun platform with more firepower than 4 infantry regiments combined. When Gunn presented his idea to his commanding officers, they thought he had lost his mind. The B-25 was a bomber. Its entire design philosophy centered on altitude and payload capacity. Converting it into a low-level attack aircraft violated every principle of air combat doctrine. Worse, Gunn wanted to fly his modified planes at treetop level, just 50 to 100 feet above the ground, directly into enemy anti-aircraft fire. It was suicide, they said. It was forbidden. It would never work. Gunn did not care what they said. He obtained permission to modify a single battle-damaged B-25 that was scheduled for scrapping anyway. Working nights and weekends with a handful of mechanics who shared his vision, Gunn began the transformation. He removed the bombardier's glazed nose section and replaced it with sheet aluminum. He mounted 4 50 caliber machine guns in the new nose angled slightly downward to converge at 200 yards. He added 2 more guns in blisters on each side of the fuselage. He reinforced the floor to handle the recoil. When he finished, his modified Mitchell carried 8 forward-firing machine guns and enough ammunition to fire continuously for 20 seconds. 20 seconds of concentrated firepower that would create a cone of destruction 30 feet wide and 600 yards long. The first test flight was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late 1942. Gunn himself climbed into the pilot seat. A skeptical audience of officers and mechanics gathered to watch what they expected to be either a spectacular failure or a suicidal disaster. Gunn lined up on a target range consisting of old trucks and wooden structures. He pushed the throttles forward and dove toward the ground, leveling off at barely 100 feet. At 200 yards from the target, he pressed the firing button. The noise was unbelievable. 8 machine guns firing simultaneously created a continuous roar like thunder that would not end. The aircraft shook violently from the recoil. Spent brass casings poured from ejection ports like golden rain, and the targets simply disappeared. When Gunn made his second pass, there was nothing left to shoot at. The trucks had been shredded into unrecognizable scrap. The wooden structures had been reduced to splinters. The sand around the target area was churned as if by a giant plow. In 3 seconds of firing, Gunn's strafer had delivered more than 300 rounds into an area the size of a tennis court. The skeptical officers stopped laughing. Word of Gunn's demonstration reached General Kenny within days. Unlike the conservative officers who had dismissed Gunn's idea, Kenny immediately understood its potential. Here was a weapon that could fly low enough to hit specific targets, fast enough to avoid effective anti-aircraft response, and armed heavily enough to destroy anything on the ground. Kenny ordered 20 more Mitchells modified to Gunn's specifications, then 50 more. Then every B-25 in the Pacific that could be spared from conventional bombing duties. The first combat test came in March 1943 at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. A Japanese convoy of 8 transport ships and 8 destroyers was steaming toward New Guinea carrying 7,000 troops and supplies for the Japanese garrison. Conventional attacks from high altitude had proven ineffective against maneuvering ships. Previous attempts to stop Japanese convoys had failed catastrophically. This time would be different. 12 of Gunn's modified strafers attacked the convoy at masthead height, flying so low that their propeller wash kicked up spray from the ocean surface. The Japanese ships had never experienced anything like it. Anti-aircraft gunners could not depress their weapons fast enough to track aircraft passing at 250 miles per hour at deck level. In 15 minutes, the strafers sank 4 transport ships and damaged every other vessel in the convoy. They killed over 3,000 Japanese soldiers before they could reach New Guinea. Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, the official Navy historian, called it the most devastating air attack against ships of the entire war. But the Bismarck Sea was just a warm-up. General Kenny had a bigger target in mind. The 4 Japanese airfields at Wewak represented the heart of enemy air power in New Guinea. If those airfields could be destroyed, the entire Japanese position in the region would collapse. The problem was that Wewak was 400 miles from the nearest Allied base. That was beyond the range of fighter escorts. The Japanese knew this. They believed their airfields were safe from serious attack because any bombers sent against them would be vulnerable to fighter interception. They were about to learn how wrong they were. In late July 1943, Allied engineers began construction on 2 new airfields near the town of Marilinen, 60 miles south of Wewak. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted the construction immediately. Intelligence officers in Wewak interpreted the activity as preparation for a new Allied offensive. They ordered bombing raids against the American construction. For 3 weeks, Japanese bombers pounded the Marilinen airfields. They dropped hundreds of bombs. They strafed construction equipment. They returned to Wewak with reports of successful attacks against American positions. What they did not know was that Marilinen was a trap. The airfields under construction were completely fake. Small crews of engineers created enormous dust clouds with trucks and graders, making it look like major construction was underway. They built wooden decoys that resembled aircraft from the air. They marked out runways that led nowhere. Every Japanese bomb fell on empty jungle, while the real American aircraft remained safely hidden at existing bases. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance aircraft photographed Wewak from extreme altitude. They counted every Japanese plane. They mapped every defensive position. They noted that the Japanese parked their aircraft in tight rows along runway edges, concentrated in perfect target formations. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. 200 Japanese aircraft sat in neat rows at Wewak, their crews confident that the American threat had been neutralized at Marilinen. On the night of August 16, 1943, bomber crews at Allied bases throughout New Guinea received their orders. Target Wewak. 4 airfields. 200 enemy aircraft. Expected opposition heavy. Expected casualties significant. Expected results decisive. But nobody knew what would happen when guns' strafers met their ultimate test. Nobody knew if low-level attack could destroy an entire air force before it could react. Nobody knew if the crazy idea of a retired Navy mechanic could change the course of the Pacific War. In 12 hours, they would find out. What happened next would become known as the Wewak Massacre, 5 days that destroyed Japanese air power in New Guinea and proved that one man's insane vision could alter the fate of nations. But the first attack was just the beginning. The Japanese would fight back with desperate courage. American crews would face anti-aircraft fire that tore their planes apart. And the real question remained unanswered. Could guns' strafers sustain their advantage when the enemy was no longer surprised? In Part 2, we will witness the horror of the first attack through the eyes of the men who flew it. See the Japanese defenders scramble in futile desperation and discover why the second day of the Wewak Massacre was even more devastating than the first. The 60 bombers at Baram, with their engines running, had only minutes to live. In Part 1, we met Paul Gunn, a 47-year-old Navy mechanic who transformed the B-25 Mitchell bomber into a flying gun platform carrying 14 machine guns. His insane modification proved devastating at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, sinking 4 transport ships in 15 minutes. Now, General George Kenny has approved a massive strike against the Japanese airfields at Wewak, 400 miles behind enemy lines. But planning an attack and executing one are very different things. The morning briefing on August 16th revealed a problem that made veteran pilots go pale. 400 miles to target, 400 miles back. 800 miles total, most of it over enemy-controlled jungle with no friendly bases for emergency landings. If a plane went down, the crew was dead or captured. There would be no rescue, and that was just the beginning of their problems. Lieutenant Colonel Clinton True, commander of the 3rd Attack Group, stood before his assembled pilots with reconnaissance photographs spread across a table. The photos showed Wewak's 4 airfields in precise detail. They showed something else that made the mission exponentially more dangerous. Anti-aircraft positions. Dozens of them. Light guns, medium guns, heavy guns, arranged in overlapping fields of fire. The Japanese had not left their aircraft undefended. Any plane flying at treetop level across those airfields would pass through a curtain of steel. True did not sugarcoat the situation. Gentlemen, we're asking you to fly 800 miles round-trip attack at 50 feet altitude and survive concentrated anti-aircraft fire from prepared positions. Some of you will not come back. That is the reality. The room was silent. Captain Edward Larner, a squadron commander from the 90th Bomb Group, raised the obvious question. Sir, how do we suppress those AA positions before our strafers come in? True's answer changed everything. We don't suppress them. We overwhelm them. 47 heavy bombers will hit from high altitude first. While the Japanese are looking up at the B-17s and B-24s, our strafers come in low. By the time their gunners realize what's happening, we'll be past them. It was elegant in theory. In practice, it required split-second timing across 200 miles of approach. The heavy bombers had to arrive exactly 3 minutes before the strafers. Too early, and the Japanese would recover before the low-level attack. Too late, and the strafers would face alert defenders. The timing window was 180 seconds. But the tactical challenge was only half the problem. The real obstacle was convincing 83 pilots to fly a mission that promised significant casualties. Major Paul Gunn himself addressed the strafer crews that evening. He did not give a patriotic speech. He did not promise glory or medals. He spoke as a mechanic explaining his tools. I built these aircraft to do exactly what we're asking them to do tomorrow. 8 guns forward, armor plate behind your seats, self-sealing fuel tanks. You can take hits and keep flying. The Japanese bombers parked at Wewak have none of that. They're fuel tanks with wings. One burst from your guns and they explode. Gunn paused and looked around the room. I won't lie to you. Some of you will get hit. Some of you might not make it home. But every plane you destroy tomorrow is a plane that won't bomb our boys on the ground next week. Every Japanese pilot you kill is a pilot who won't shoot down your friends next month. Lieutenant William Benn, who would fly in the second wave over Borum, remembered Gunn's final words. He looked at us and said something I'll never forget. He said, I wish I could fly with you tomorrow, but they won't let me. So I'm trusting you with my babies. Bring them home bloody. Bring them home shot up. Just bring them home with empty ammunition boxes. That's how I'll know you did your job. The crews dispersed to their aircraft for final preparations. Armorers loaded 40,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition across the strafer fleet. Mechanics topped off fuel tanks and checked engines. Intelligence officers distributed target photographs with specific assignments for each squadron. Nobody slept well that night. At 0300 hours on August 17th, engines began coughing to life across multiple Allied airfields. The sound of radial engines echoed through the tropical darkness as aircraft after aircraft came alive. Ground crews guided the big bombers to their runway positions. Pilots performed final instrument checks. At 0430, the first wave launched. 47 heavy bombers climbed into the pre-dawn sky, formed up, and headed northwest toward Wewak. Behind them, 33 strafers waited for their turn. The P-38 Lightning escorts were already climbing to altitude, their twin engines leaving contrails against the lightening sky. The flight to Wewak took 90 minutes for the high-altitude bombers. The strafers flying low and slow to conserve fuel would arrive 8 minutes later. Everything depended on the timing. At 0745, the heavy bombers appeared over Wewak. They came from the south at 15,000 feet, their formations visible for miles against the morning sky. Japanese spotters saw them immediately. Air raid sirens wailed across all 4 airfields. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, sending black puffs of smoke blossoming around the bomber formations. At Borum Airfield, the reaction was confusion rather than panic. Squadron commanders looked up at the distant bombers and made a fatal assessment. The Americans were targeting Wewak main base several miles away. Standard procedure at Borum was clear: continue mission preparation. The 60 Betty bombers scheduled to attack Marillion would launch on time. The Japanese crews continued their pre-flight checks. Engines warmed up. Pilots adjusted their harnesses. In 6 minutes, they would begin their takeoff roll. They had 6 minutes to live. 3 miles south of Borum, flying at 50 feet above the jungle canopy, Lieutenant Colonel True led the first wave of strafers toward their target. His B-25 shook violently in the turbulent morning air. Beside him, his co-pilot watched the altimeter needle hover just above the treetops. 1 minute out, the navigator called. True keyed his radio. All flights, weapons hot. Attack formation. Hit them hard. The 8 strafers of the first wave spread into a line abreast, covering nearly half a mile of frontage. Behind them, the second and third waves followed at 30-second intervals. The jungle canopy flashed beneath them in a blur of green. Then the trees ended. Borum Airfield appeared like a photograph suddenly coming into focus. The 2 parallel rows of Betty bombers, the spinning propellers, the ground crews standing beside the aircraft. For one frozen moment, everything was perfectly still. True pressed the firing button. 850 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous thunder that drowned out the engine roar. Tracer rounds streaked across the airfield in lines of fire. The first Betty bomber in the row simply disintegrated its fuel tanks, rupturing in a cascade of flame. Behind True, the other 7 strafers of the first wave opened fire. 64 machine guns creating a wall of destruction 400 yards wide. The effect on the densely packed Japanese bombers was apocalyptic. Aircraft exploded in their parking positions. Pilots who had been running through their checklists died before they could process what was happening. Ground crews who ran toward the fires were cut down by the second wave of strafers, arriving 30 seconds behind the first. Lieutenant Ben's aircraft came in over the eastern edge of Borum. Through his windscreen, he saw nothing but fire and smoke where 60 bombers had been parked. His forward gunner was already firing hosing tracer rounds into anything that looked intact. "Jesus Christ," Ben's co-pilot whispered. "There's nothing left." They made their attack run anyway, expending 2,000 rounds in 20 seconds. When they pulled up and banked away, secondary explosions were detonating across the entire airfield. Ammunition cooking off, fuel tanks rupturing, the chain reaction of destruction spreading from aircraft to aircraft. The entire first attack on Borum lasted 47 seconds. At Wewak main base, the same horror unfolded. Strafers from the 38th Bomb Group caught 40 fighters parked in neat rows, their pilots still in the ready room waiting for scramble orders that came too late. The Oscar and Tony fighters, built for maneuverability rather than protection, offered even less resistance to 50 caliber fire than the bombers. A handful of Japanese pilots reached their aircraft. 3 managed to start engines. 1 actually lifted off the runway before a P-38 Lightning dove on his position and shot him down. He crashed back onto the runway in a ball of flame, blocking the takeoff path for anyone who might have followed. At Dagwa and Boot airfields, the pattern repeated. Surprise. Overwhelming firepower. Total destruction. Aircraft that had taken months to ship from Japan that represented millions of yen, an investment that carried pilots trained for years in demanding programs, were reduced to burning scrap in seconds. By 08:15, the strafers were withdrawing. They left behind absolute devastation. 120 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Another 30 damaged beyond repair. Fuel dumps burning. Ammunition exploding. Runways cratered. The 4th Air Army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. American losses for the entire mission: 0 aircraft. Not a single strafer was shot down during the first attack. When reconnaissance photographs reached General Kenny's headquarters that afternoon, his staff could barely believe what they were seeing. The 4 Wewak airfields looked like the aftermath of an earthquake. Burned-out aircraft hulks littered every visible surface. Smoke still rose from fuel storage areas. Nothing moved. Kenny studied the photographs for a long moment. Then he issued new orders. "We're not done. Schedule strikes for the 18th, 20th, and 21st. Hit them again before they can recover. I want every aircraft at Wewak destroyed or damaged. No exceptions." His staff exchanged glances. The first attack had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Why risk more missions against a target that was already crippled? Kenny anticipated their objection. "The Japanese will fly in replacements. They'll repair what they can. They'll disperse their remaining aircraft into the jungle. If we give them a week to recover, we'll have to do this all over again. We hit them now while they're still in shock. We hit them again tomorrow. We keep hitting them until there's nothing left to hit." It was brutal logic. It was also exactly right. But the Japanese were not helpless. Even in their devastation, they prepared to fight back. Anti-aircraft crews who had survived the first attack repositioned their guns. Fighter pilots from other bases were ordered to Wewak to provide air defense. Commanders began dispersing surviving aircraft into camouflaged positions. And in Tokyo, intelligence officers were already analyzing reports from Wewak. They had never seen an attack like this. Low-level strafers with unprecedented firepower. Split-second timing that bypassed their warning systems. Overwhelming force concentrated against unprepared targets. Someone had invented a new way to wage air war. The Japanese needed to understand it, counter it, and defeat it. They had exactly 18 hours before the next attack. On the morning of August 18th, as American strafers prepared for their second mission, Japanese commanders at Wewak made a discovery that chilled them to the bone. The reconnaissance photographs they had been receiving from Marilyn showed construction of American airfields. Urgent intelligence assessments had triggered the very concentration of forces that made the first attack so devastating. Those photographs were fake. The airfields were decoys. The entire Japanese response had been manipulated from the beginning. The Wewak massacre was not just an attack. It was a trap designed from the first moment to concentrate Japanese aircraft exactly where American strafers could destroy them. And the Americans were coming back. In Part 3, we will witness the brutal second and third days of the Wewak attacks, when Japanese defenders fought back with desperate courage and American crews faced anti-aircraft fire that tore their planes apart. We will meet the Japanese pilots who flew suicidal missions against overwhelming odds and the American strafer crews who kept pressing attacks despite mounting losses. The massacre had only begun. The deadliest days were still to come. In Part 1, we met Paul Gunn, the Navy mechanic, who transformed B-25 bombers into flying gun platforms. In Part 2, we witnessed the devastating first strike that destroyed 120 Japanese aircraft in 47 seconds. The attack was so successful that General Kenny ordered 3 more strikes to finish the job completely. But the Japanese were not dead yet. They were wounded, bleeding, desperate. And desperate enemies fight back. On the evening of August 17th, while American pilots celebrated their victory, Japanese commanders at Wewak held an emergency conference in a bunker that shook with secondary explosions. Colonel Kazuo Tanikawa surveyed the damage reports with growing horror. 120 aircraft destroyed, 300 airmen dead or wounded, fuel reserves burning, ammunition depots detonating. The Fourth Air Army had lost 60% of its strength in a single morning. But Tanikawa was not thinking about the past. He was thinking about tomorrow. The Americans would return. He was certain of it. Any competent commander would press the advantage. The question was how to survive the next attack. Orders went out immediately. Disperse all surviving aircraft into the jungle. Camouflage everything. Reposition anti-aircraft batteries to cover low-altitude approaches. Request immediate reinforcements from bases in the Philippines and Rabaul. Most critically, Tanikawa ordered every available fighter pilot to be airborne at dawn. If the Americans returned, they would not find the Japanese helpless on the ground a second time. Tanikawa did not know that his preparations were already too late. The Americans were launching their second strike before the sun rose. But the Japanese were not the only ones facing problems. At Allied headquarters in Port Moresby, a furious argument erupted between General Kenny and his logistics staff. The first attack had consumed 40,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, nearly the entire reserve supply in New Guinea. The strafers had returned with empty ammunition boxes exactly as Paul Gunn had requested. The problem was that empty ammunition boxes meant empty ammunition boxes for the next mission. Supply officers calculated the numbers with growing alarm. The second strike was scheduled for 0600 hours. Available ammunition would arm only 22 strafers instead of 33. The remaining 11 aircraft would fly with partial loads or not fly at all. Kenny made a brutal decision. 22 strafers would attack. The others would wait for resupply. Every available round would be loaded. Every gun would fire until it was empty. The reduced force meant increased risk. Fewer aircraft covering the same airfields, less suppressive fire against anti-aircraft positions, higher probability of losses. Lieutenant William Benn learned of the ammunition shortage during the pre-dawn briefing. His B-25 would carry only 1,600 rounds per gun instead of the standard 2,000. 80 seconds of firing time instead of 100. Make every burst count, the briefing officer told them. We don't have rounds to waste. The weather on August 18th was deteriorating. Tropical storms had moved into the Wewak area overnight. Heavy clouds obscured the high-altitude bombers. Rain squalls reduced visibility. The strafers would attack without their aerial distraction. At 0615, the first strafers cleared the jungle canopy north of Dagwa airfield. What they found was different from the day before. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners were waiting. The surviving batteries had been repositioned during the night, arranged in overlapping fields of fire along the most likely attack routes. When the American strafers appeared, every gun opened fire simultaneously. Captain Edward Larner led the first wave toward Dagwa. His aircraft shuddered as a 20mm shell punched through the left wing. Another round shattered his co-pilot's side window, showering the cockpit with glass. Larner held course and pressed the firing button. Ahead of him, the dispersed Japanese aircraft were harder targets than the neat rows of the previous day. Planes hidden under camouflage netting. Fighters tucked into jungle revetments. Nothing sat in the open. Larner raked a line of palm trees where reconnaissance photos showed hidden aircraft. Flames erupted from beneath the camouflage. He pulled up sharply as tracers streaked past his canopy. Behind him, Lieutenant James Carter's B-25 took a direct hit from a 40mm shell. The round penetrated the bomb bay and detonated among the parafrag clusters. The aircraft exploded in midair, scattering wreckage across half a mile of jungle. All 6 crew members died instantly. Carter's was the first American strafer lost in the Wewak campaign. The second wave pressed their attack despite the loss. More strafers swept across Dagua and bought airfields hunting for hidden targets. Their guns tore through camouflage netting and jungle cover. Secondary explosions marked successful hits on concealed aircraft. At Wewak Main Base, the Japanese mounted their most determined defense. A dozen Ki-43 Oscar fighters had launched before the strafers arrived. They dove on the American formation from 8,000 feet, their pilots determined to exact revenge for the previous day's slaughter. The P-38 Lightning escorts intercepted them at 3,000 feet. The dogfight lasted 11 minutes. Japanese pilots flew with suicidal courage, pressing attacks against the bigger, faster Lightnings, despite impossible odds. Lieutenant Teo Tanamizu shot down one P-38 before 4 Lightnings converged on his position. His Oscar disintegrated under concentrated fire. When the aerial combat ended, 9 Japanese fighters had been destroyed. The remaining 3 fled toward Rabaul, their ammunition exhausted. The P-38s had lost 2 aircraft, both pilots killed. Below, the strafers completed their runs and withdrew. Damage assessment would take hours, but the initial reports were encouraging. Approximately 40 more Japanese aircraft destroyed or damaged. Anti-aircraft positions silenced. Fuel storage areas still burning from the previous day, reignited by new fires. The cost was 3 American aircraft lost. 18 crew members dead or missing. The equation was brutal but favorable. 3 American planes for 40 Japanese. The exchange rate that would win the war. General Kenny reviewed the reports that afternoon and issued orders for the third strike. August 20th. Maximum effort. Every available strafer with full ammunition loads. The resupply ships had arrived from Australia overnight. Mountains of 50 caliber ammunition were being trucked to forward airfields. The strafers would return to Wewak with full magazines. But something unexpected had happened during the August 18th attack, something that would prove more significant than the aircraft destroyed. Japanese morale at Wewak had collapsed. Sergeant Saburo Kitahara, a Zero pilot who survived by being on patrol during the first attack, described the atmosphere in his post-war memoir. After the second attack, men simply stopped trying. Pilots refused to sleep in barracks near the airfield. Ground crews abandoned their posts when aircraft engines were heard. Officers who ordered men to their stations were ignored. Everyone knew that staying near the aircraft meant death. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese pilots who had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years suddenly confronted an enemy they could not fight. The strafers came too fast for interception. They flew too low for anti-aircraft tracking. They carried firepower that shredded aircraft in seconds. There was no defense. There was no escape. There was only death raining from the sky without warning. Colonel Tanakawa attempted to restore discipline with threats and punishments. He executed 2 enlisted men for desertion. He stripped a lieutenant of rank for abandoning his post. Nothing worked. The 4th Air Army was psychologically broken. The third attack on August 20th encountered almost no resistance. The strafers swept across all 4 airfields in methodical waves. They found Japanese aircraft scattered throughout the surrounding jungle, hidden under trees covered with palm fronds tucked into ravines. The dispersal made individual targets harder to find. It did not matter. The Americans had brought 53 strafers and 80 P-38 escorts. They saturated the target area with firepower. Parafrag bombs carpeted suspected hiding areas. Machine guns raked every possible concealment position. The jungle itself seemed to burn. 23 more Japanese aircraft were confirmed destroyed. Another 15 were damaged. Anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and inaccurate. Japanese fighters did not appear. American losses on August 20th, 0. The final attack came on August 21st. By then, the 4th Air Army had fewer than 30 operational aircraft remaining. Many of these had been flown in from other bases to replace losses. Their pilots were unfamiliar with the local terrain. Their ground crews were demoralized refugees from the previous attacks. Kenny committed everything to the final strike. 61 strafers, 92 P-38 escorts, the largest low-level attack force assembled in the Pacific War to date. The Japanese made one last desperate attempt at defense. 23 fighters launched to intercept the American formation. They climbed into the morning sun, outnumbered 4-1, knowing they were flying to their deaths. The air battle over Wewak lasted 17 minutes. P-38 Lightnings tore through the Japanese formation with brutal efficiency. The Lightning's superior speed and firepower overwhelmed the more maneuverable but slower Japanese fighters. Pilots who tried to dogfight were shot down. Pilots who tried to flee were run down. When the battle ended, 20 Japanese fighters had been destroyed. 3 survived to land at emergency strips further west. The P-38s lost 4 aircraft. Below, the strafers completed the destruction of the 4th Air Army. They found the last intact aircraft on the airfields and shredded them. They destroyed maintenance facilities that might have repaired damaged planes. They strafed fuel trucks and ammunition dumps. By noon on August 21, 1943, it was over. The accounting was staggering. In 5 days of sustained attacks, American forces had destroyed 175 Japanese aircraft. The 4th Air Army, which had begun August with 200 operational aircraft, was reduced to fewer than 25 flyable planes. More importantly, the organizational infrastructure was devastated. Experienced pilots were dead. Ground crews were scattered. Fuel supplies were exhausted. Ammunition stocks were depleted. The airfields themselves were cratered and burning. American losses for the entire campaign: 10 aircraft. 60 crew members killed or missing. The exchange rate was 17 Japanese aircraft for every American plane lost. It was the most lopsided air victory of the Pacific War. News of the Wewak massacre spread rapidly through Allied commands. General Douglas MacArthur personally commended Kenny and the 5th Air Force. War correspondents filed stories about the devastating new attack tactics. The B-25 Strafer became famous overnight. More significantly, the strategic situation in New Guinea transformed completely. Japanese air power, which had constrained Allied operations for 18 months, simply ceased to exist as a factor. Ground forces could advance without fear of bombing. Supply convoys could move without fighter escort. Amphibious landings could proceed without air opposition. The town of Lae fell to Australian forces in September 1943. Finschhafen was captured in October. By December, the Allies controlled the entire Huon Peninsula. The advance that had stalled for months accelerated into a relentless offensive. None of this would have been possible without air superiority. Air superiority was won at Wewak in 5 devastating days. Paul Gunn received the Distinguished Service Cross for his contributions to the campaign. The citation praised his extraordinary engineering innovation and tireless dedication to improving the combat effectiveness of American aircraft. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel. But Gunn did not attend the award ceremony. He was already back in his hangar working on the next modification. There were more aircraft to convert, more guns to install, more enemies to destroy. The war was not over. The Japanese still held the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and thousands of Pacific islands. The road to Tokyo stretched thousands of miles ahead. But the Wewak massacre had proven something that would shape the remainder of the war. Low-level attack aviation properly equipped and tactically employed could achieve decisive results against prepared defenses. The concept that generals had dismissed as insane had become standard doctrine. And one question remained unanswered. What happened to the man whose crazy idea had changed everything? What became of Paul Gunn after Wewak? The answer involves a personal tragedy, a controversial decision, and a legacy that extends far beyond World War II. In Part 4, we will discover Paul Gunn's final chapter, the price he paid for his dedication, and why his name should be remembered, alongside the greatest innovators in military aviation history. This story has one more chapter, and it is the most remarkable of all. In Part 1, we met Paul Gunn, a 47-year-old Navy mechanic who dared to transform bombers into flying gun platforms. In Part 2, we witnessed the first devastating strike that caught 60 Japanese bombers with engines running. In Part 3, we saw 5 days of sustained attacks that destroyed 175 aircraft and shattered an entire Japanese air army. But what happened to the man whose insane idea made it all possible? What became of Paul Irving Gunn after the smoke cleared over Wewak? This story has one final twist. Because success sometimes comes with a price that nobody expects to pay. Paul Gunn did not celebrate the Wewak victory. He could not. While his strafers were destroying the 4th Air Army, Gunn was carrying a burden heavier than any bomb load. His wife and 4 children were prisoners of the Japanese. When the war began in December 1941, Gunn had been running a small airline in the Philippines. His family lived in Manila. When the Japanese invaded, Gunn escaped to Australia to join the fight. His family did not escape. They were captured and interned at Santo Tomas prison camp, where thousands of American civilians spent the war in brutal captivity. For 3 years, Paul Gunn worked 18-hour days modifying aircraft, knowing that his wife Polly and his children were suffering in a Japanese prison. Every strafer he built, every gun he installed, every improvement he made was driven by a desperate hope. If the Americans could advance fast enough, if the war could end soon enough, his family might survive. The Wewak massacre accelerated the Allied advance by months. The elimination of Japanese air power opened the path to the Philippines. Every week that the campaign shortened was a week less that Gunn's family spent in captivity. In February 1945, American forces liberated Santo Tomas prison camp. Paul Gunn flew to Manila immediately. He had not seen his family in 3 years. He did not know if they were alive. They were alive. Barely. Polly Gunn weighed 87 pounds. The children were skeletal, suffering from malnutrition and tropical diseases. They had survived beatings, starvation rations, and the constant threat of execution. But they had survived. The reunion was documented by Army photographers. The images show a middle-aged man in a flight suit embracing a woman who looks decades older than her years. Their children cluster around them, thin arms wrapped around their father. Paul Gunn is weeping. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for his contributions to the war. He was promoted to colonel. General Douglas MacArthur personally thanked him for his innovations. But Gunn never spoke publicly about his achievements. He refused interviews. He declined invitations to ceremonies. When asked why, he gave the same answer every time. "I was just doing my job. The real heroes are the boys who flew those planes into enemy fire." Paul Gunn retired from the Army Air Forces in 1946. He returned to the Philippines with his family and rebuilt his small airline. He spent the next decade flying cargo between the islands, maintaining his own aircraft, training young Filipino pilots. He never returned to military service. He died in 1957 at the age of 61, largely forgotten by the public that had briefly celebrated his wartime innovations. His obituary in the Manila newspapers mentioned his airline business. It did not mention the strafers. It did not mention Wewak. It did not mention that his crazy idea had destroyed more enemy aircraft than most fighter squadrons claimed in the entire war. But the legacy of Paul Gunn did not die with him. The B-25 Mitchell strafer concept that Gunn pioneered became the foundation for an entirely new category of military aircraft, the dedicated ground attack plane. The principle was simple but revolutionary. Take a medium-sized airframe packet with forward-firing weapons, fly low and fast, and destroy ground targets with overwhelming firepower. This concept shaped military aviation for the next 80 years. During the Korean War, the Douglas A-26 Invader, a direct descendant of Gunn's modified Mitchells, conducted thousands of ground attack missions against North Korean and Chinese forces. The aircraft carried 850 caliber machine guns in the nose, exactly like Gunn's original design. Pilots who flew the Invader called it the most effective ground attack platform of the war. In Vietnam, the concept evolved further. The AC-47 Spooky gunship mounted multiple miniguns in a cargo aircraft, creating a flying weapons platform that could circle above a target and deliver devastating firepower. The principle was identical to Gunn's vision: maximum guns, maximum firepower, overwhelming force against ground targets. The modern A-10 Thunderbolt II, the famous Warthog that dominates close air support missions today, is a direct philosophical descendant of Gunn's strafers. The A-10 is designed around its primary weapon, a massive 30mm cannon that can destroy tanks and armored vehicles. The aircraft exists to deliver that gun to the target exactly as Gunn's Mitchells existed to deliver their 850 caliber weapons. More than 11,000 B-25 Mitchells were produced during World War II. Hundreds were modified to Gunn's strafer configuration. These aircraft served in every theater of the war, from the Pacific to the Mediterranean to the European mainland. They sank ships, destroyed trains, shredded convoys, and supported ground troops in countless operations. After the war, surplus Mitchells were sold to air forces around the world. The aircraft served in Indonesia, Brazil, the Netherlands, and a dozen other nations. Some remained in military service until the 1970s, 3 decades after Gunn made his first modifications in a maintenance hangar in Australia. The total number of enemy aircraft ships and vehicles destroyed by gun-style strafers has never been calculated precisely. Conservative estimates suggest that the various strafer variants destroyed more than 2,000 enemy aircraft on the ground alone. The Wewak massacre accounts for 175 of these, but similar attacks occurred at airfields throughout the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. The human cost prevented by these attacks is even harder to measure. Every Japanese bomber destroyed at Wewak was a bomber that could not attack Allied shipping. Every fighter eliminated was a fighter that could not intercept American aircraft. The acceleration of the Pacific Campaign enabled by air superiority won at Wewak, and similar operations shortened the war by weeks or months. Weeks or months of war in the Pacific meant tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945 were dropped partly because military planners estimated that an invasion of Japan would cost 1 million American casualties. Every week, the war shortened. Every advance made possible by air superiority reduced the ultimate cost in blood. Paul Gunn's insane idea did not just win battles. It saved lives. Thousands of lives. Perhaps tens of thousands. But the most important lesson of Paul Gunn's story is not about aircraft or weapons. It is about innovation itself. Gunn was not a formally educated engineer. He held no advanced degrees. He had no background in aeronautical design. He was a mechanic who worked with his hands, who understood machines because he had spent 30 years fixing them. The experts dismissed his ideas because he lacked credentials. The generals rejected his proposals because they violated established doctrine, and he was right. They were wrong. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The tank was invented by a journalist and developed by naval officers over the objections of cavalry generals. Radar was dismissed as impractical by the experts who thought visual observation would always be superior. The atomic bomb was conceived by refugee physicists whom the established scientific community had ignored for years. The lesson is uncomfortable but essential. Expertise can become a prison. Experience can blind us to new possibilities. The person closest to the problem, the person who works with their hands rather than their theories, often sees solutions that the experts cannot imagine. Paul Gunn saw what the bomber could become because he was not trained to see what the bomber was supposed to be. His lack of formal education freed him from the assumptions that trapped better credentialed engineers. His outsider status allowed him to propose ideas that insiders would never consider. Modern military organizations study this phenomenon extensively. They call it disruptive innovation. They create programs to encourage ideas from non-traditional sources. They try to prevent the institutional resistance that almost killed Gunn's concept before it could prove itself. The same principle applies far beyond military affairs. In business and science, in every field of human endeavor, the breakthrough ideas often come from unexpected sources. The outsider who asks the naive question, the newcomer who has not learned what is impossible, the mechanic who looks at a bomber and sees a gun platform. And there is one final detail about Paul Gunn that almost no one knows. In 1943, while working on strafer modifications in Australia, Gunn kept a small photograph in his workspace. It showed his wife Polly and their 4 children taken before the war, before the Japanese invasion, before everything fell apart. Gunn would look at that photograph every night before going to sleep and every morning before starting work. His crew chief asked him once why he worked such brutal hours. 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, month after month. Gunn pointed to the photograph. "Every plane I finish is one more chance to bring them home," he said. "Every gun I install is one more way to kill the bastards who are holding them. I'll sleep when the war is over. I'll rest when my family is free." When Santo Tomas was liberated in February 1945, Paul Gunn was one of the first Americans to enter the camp. He found his family in a barracks building that had been converted to a hospital ward. They were too weak to stand. He carried his children out of the camp in his arms, one by one. The photograph that had hung in his Australian workshop for 3 years was still in his flight suit pocket. He showed it to Polly. She cried. She said he had kept his promise. Paul Gunn had not just built weapons. He had not just won battles. He had fought his way across the Pacific to save his family. Every strafer, every modification, every improvement was a step closer to that barracks in Santo Tomas. That is why this story matters. Not because of the aircraft destroyed or the battles won, but because it shows what one person can accomplish when they refuse to accept what the experts say is impossible. When they keep working despite ridicule and rejection. When they hold on to hope through years of separation and uncertainty. From a retired Navy mechanic with a crazy idea to the destruction of an entire enemy air army in 5 days. Paul Irving Gunn proved that innovation comes from those who do the work, not those who write the theories. And because of his insane modification, 175 Japanese aircraft were destroyed at Wewak. The Pacific Campaign accelerated by months, and countless American and Allied lives were saved. The next time someone tells you that your idea is impossible, remember Paul Gunn. Remember the mechanic who looked at a bomber and saw something different. Remember the man who built gun platforms while his family waited in a prison camp. Remember that the experts are not always right. If you know stories like this, untold tales of ordinary people who changed history, share them in the comments. Subscribe to discover more forgotten innovations that shaped our world. Because history is full of Paul Gunn's mechanics and farmers and clerks who saw what the experts could not see. Wars are not won by generals alone. They are won by the people who refuse to accept that anything is impossible.